The invitation came through official channels, which is how I knew they didn't expect me to actually show up. It was routed through the Cultural Engagement Directorate, stamped with 3 different committee seals, and worded in that particular bureaucratic register that means, "We are required to offer this. We assume you will decline. Please decline so we can get on with things." The Sethiru Rethek trials had never had a human entrant. In 11 cycles of competition, spread across what amounted to about 40 standard years, they had welcomed representatives from 9 other species, all of them multi-limbed, all of them sensor-capable, all of them equipped with the kind of precision-assist hardware that makes the trials what they are, the galaxy's preeminent test of guided projectile accuracy under controlled conditions. We were invited, the letter explained, because the Accord of Koveth Ring required all provisional member species to be extended participation rights in any sanctioned interspecies athletic event. We had signed the accord. We were therefore invited. The letter was very careful not to say that it hoped we would participate. It just noted, in a supplementary clause, that any human entrant would be placed in the exhibition bracket, which was non-competitive and did not affect the official standings, and that the exhibition results would be recorded in a separate column of the official report. A separate column. I read that twice, then forwarded the whole thing to my direct superior with a note that said, "I would like to attend." She forwarded it upward with a note that said, "Vang wants to go." Her superior wrote back in about 6 minutes, which suggested he found it funny, and his message said, "Fine. Don't embarrass us." Then, as an afterthought, how? That was a reasonable question. I thought about it for 2 days, then sent back a single line, "I'll bring the darts." There was a longer pause after that one. About 9 hours, then approved, budget code attached, good luck. I packed light. The darts case was the kind that closes with 2 latches and has a foam interior cut to fit a set of 12 tungsten barrels, a spare set of flights, a roll of shaft replacements, and a small measuring tool for checking point integrity. It had traveled with me to 6 postings across 4 systems. The case itself was scuffed at the corners and had a custom sticker on the bottom from a processing station that no longer existed. A colleague who saw it on my desk before I left told me it looked like I was packing for a camping trip, not a precision athletics event involving some of the most technically sophisticated throwing apparatus in the explored sectors. I thanked him for the observation. I also brought a portable board, which folds flat and is about the size of a field tablet. The bristle surface rolls up inside the frame. The whole assembly weighs less than 2 kilograms. The Koveth Ring station was large. Most of the permanent population was Sethiru, which meant the corridors were built for a species that averaged 2.5 meters and carried its body weight on 4 lower limbs, while the upper 2 were free for carrying, and the middle pair could go either way depending on the task. The door frames were high. The counters were high. The seating in the transit hub was built for a body with a longer torso and a different center of gravity, so I sat slightly forward with my feet not quite reaching the floor, which was fine. I was used to it. 6 postings will do that for you. You stop noticing the chair height after the 3rd station. The station itself was impressive in the way that Sethiru architecture tends to be impressive. Very clean, very precise, nothing wasted, every surface serving a function. The lighting was cool and even. The signage was in Sethiru script with, in the areas designated for interspecies transit, a secondary line in Galactic Standard. The concession areas near the hub sold food that smelled like nothing I recognized, and one thing that smelled faintly like coffee, which turned out to be a grain-based hot drink that wasn't coffee but wasn't bad, and which I had 2 cups of while I waited for my transit assignment to be processed. I took a note in my field log. Grain drink, concourse level, recommend. This is the kind of operational intelligence that a scout and cultural observer accumulates, and that seems trivial until you are cold and tired on a long transit, and remember that one of the stops has something drinkable. The registration desk was staffed by a Sethiru official named Irkit, according to the tag at their station. And Irkit had the sensor filaments that denoted a certain rank in Sethiru administrative culture, fine, thread-like structures that ran along the upper cranium, and were apparently sensitive to air pressure gradients and vibration in ways that made bureaucratic Sethiru very good at detecting when someone was being evasive. Irkit looked at my travel documentation, looked at me, looked at my travel documentation again, and then looked at the case I had set on the counter. "This is your equipment?" they asked. "Yes," I said. "Both items?" "The board and the darts, yes." Irkit was quiet for a moment. Their filaments moved very slightly, which I had been briefed meant something like a recalibration of a prior assumption. The invitation specified that entrants should arrive with their full equipment suite, they said, for processing and inspection. "That's all of it," I said. "There is no guidance array." "No. No haptic calibration rig." "No. No." Irkit paused, as if consulting an internal list of things that should be present. "No smart assist housing. For the projectile interface." "It's just the darts," I said, "and the board." Irkit looked at the case again. Their expression was the Sethiru equivalent of neutral, which is to say it was very still, but the filaments moved again, a slightly longer motion this time. They typed something into their console. There was a short silence during which I gathered I was being looked up, cross-referenced, and possibly discussed in a separate channel. Then Irkit printed a credential chip and slid it across the counter. "Exhibition bracket," they said. "Yes," I said. "Non-competitive, separate column." "I understand." Irkit's gaze dropped to the case again. Briefly, the way you look at something that you've decided isn't your problem. "Welcome to the Rithek trials, warrant officer." I picked up my case and my board and found my assigned quarters, which were thoughtfully human-scaled and had a chair at the right height and a bunk that fit a human body. Someone had planned for this, at least at the accommodation level. There was a card on the small table explaining the schedule and a supplementary note that said, in polite but firm language, that exhibition entrants were welcome to observe all preliminary and main card rounds, that they would be assigned their own slot on the secondary floor during a scheduled intermission, and that they were welcome to attend the post-event reception. The word "welcome" appeared 4 times in the supplementary note. I counted. I read the schedule twice. Then I set up the board on the wall across from the bunk, measured the distance with my tape, 2.37 meters from the face of the board to the throw line, which is the standard human regulation distance, and threw for about an hour until my arm felt right. The tungsten was cold from travel. It always is, after time in luggage hold, and cold tungsten doesn't group the same way until it's been handled for a while, the barrels warming to body temperature and the flight-to-shaft connection settling. I threw without hurrying through this. There's no shortcut. By the end of the first 20 darts, the grouping was tightening. By the end of 40, the grip felt like mine again. By the end of the hour, the grouping was where I wanted it. I pulled the darts, stowed the board, and went to find dinner. Dinner was eaten alone in the section of the station canteen set aside for non-Sethiru visitors. It was a reasonable meal. I had brought field rations as backup, which I did not need. The canteen staff, to their credit, had done their research. The items labeled in the non-Sethiru section were genuinely edible, and one of them, a grain and protein dish that was probably modeled on something someone had told them humans ate, was actually good. I ate 2 portions of it and made a note in my field log, catering, good. Then I went back to my quarters and slept. The first full day of the trials was qualifying rounds. I watched from the observation gallery on the second tier, which had good sightlines over the main floor and a railing I could lean against. The gallery was largely Sethiru, with the specific quality of attention that a home crowd gives a home culture event. Engaged, knowledgeable, quiet in a way that meant they were absorbing rather than performing enthusiasm. There was applause, but it was measured, and it came at the moments that an informed watcher would mark as the genuinely excellent throws, not just any good score. I respected that. The Sethiru competitors entered in pairs for the preliminary rounds, each pair assigned to one of 12 lanes. The lanes were calibrated with sensor arrays along both walls, the kind of passive scanning infrastructure that tracked a projectile from release to impact and recorded every parameter: trajectory deviation, spin rate, angular velocity at the point of release, micro-corrections applied during flight. The Sethiru equipment was designed to interface with this array. The Smart Assist housing, the thing IRCIT had asked about, was a wrist-mounted processor that read the lane sensor data in real time, calculated the ideal release parameters for each throw, and sent haptic feedback to the throwing limbs to guide the adjustment. A trained Sethiru competitor could execute that adjustment in the time between drawing back and releasing. The adjustment was small. We were talking about fine motor corrections measured in fractions of a millimeter. But at the distances and scoring precision the trials demanded, a fraction of a millimeter was significant. The scoring surface was a flat panel, no sections, no bullseye in the way I thought of it. It was a gradient target, a continuous field of scoring density that peaked at the center and decreased in a mathematically smooth curve toward the edges. Each throw was scored to 4 decimal places. The system totaled your score across a round of 30 throws, and the qualifying threshold was a minimum average that I calculated was equivalent to hitting within about 8 millimeters of dead center on every throw, consistently, with no significant variance. 8 millimeters. At the trial's competition distance, which the schedule listed as 4.2 meters, not 2.37, 4.2. I wrote that number in my field log and sat with it for a few minutes. Then I watched the first pair of competitors take their positions. They were both tall, even by Sethiru standards. The species averaged 2.5 meters, but these two were closer to 3, and the throwing limb, the upper right limb, which was the primary for both, had a length and a range of motion that I found myself noting carefully. The shoulder joint on a Sethiru was more complex than the human equivalent, capable of a locking position at full extension that created a momentary stability before release. In a human thrower, maintaining that kind of stability at full extension required dedicated training, because the human shoulder joint is not naturally a locking mechanism. You're fighting the joint's natural tendency to continue moving. In the Sethiru, the lock was structural. It was, from a pure mechanical standpoint, an advantage. They threw beautifully. There is no other word for it. The sequence was stance, draw, a very brief settling, release. The settling was the key moment, the instant where the haptic system was reading the sensor data and the body was receiving the feedback and making the final micro-adjustment. It was almost invisible. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you might not see it at all. You might just see a Sethiru standing at a throw line and releasing a projectile, and the projectile landing very close to center, and the score appearing, and the Sethiru moving on to the next throw. I was looking for it, so I saw it. A very small late correction in the final degree of the draw, a tiny settling in the wrist just before the lock and release, the haptic feedback doing its job. The scores reflected the system working. The first pair averaged something in the high 90s on a 100-point scale, with individual throws touching 98 and 99. The gallery produced its measured, knowledgeable response. I wrote in my field log, scores, 96.4 and 97.1 paired AVG, corrections visible at close observation. System latency, estimate under 40 ms. A Sethiru in the seat to my left, who I had not yet spoken to, leaned slightly in my direction at the end of the first pair's round. "You are the human entrant," they said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. They looked at me with the particular quality of attention that meant they were making an assessment. Sethiru eyes are forward-facing, deep-set, with a very slight luminescence at the iris. You could always tell when one was looking at you directly versus peripherally. This one was looking at me directly. I saw your equipment at check-in, they said. You are in exhibition. That's right. The small case, they said, the flat board. Yes. They were quiet for a moment. There was not, in what followed, any particular malice. It was more the tone of someone explaining something to a person who might not understand the context. The trials are a precision event, they said. The Smart Assist systems are calibrated to the individual competitor over months of integration. The sensor arrays in the lanes are tuned for specific projectile profiles. A slight pause. Human throwing apparatus. They seem to consider their phrasing carefully. It is not common for us to see unassisted entry in an event of this caliber. I imagine not, I said. The exhibition bracket is a good opportunity to observe the event format, they said, and there was a genuine helpfulness in it which I appreciated. They meant it kindly. They thought I had come to watch and be present and go home with a credential chip in my pocket that said I had participated, which was the polite fiction of the exhibition bracket. The separate column made real to you in a real conversation. It is, I agreed. I'm learning a lot already. They turned back to the floor as the second pair took their positions, satisfied, apparently, that we understood each other. I watched the rest of qualifying from the gallery and took notes. Not on the scores, I had the official feed for that, but on the details that the feed didn't capture. The way the best competitors settled before a throw, a very brief stillness, a particular quality of suspension that preceded the arm's movement, the moment the haptic system locked in and the body quieted around it. The angle of the elbow joint on the back draw. The speed of the delivery, faster than I had expected, a sharp release rather than a floated one. The follow-through, which was minimal. The Smart Assist had done its work before the projectile left the hand, so the arm completed its arc without urgency, just carrying through the motion. I also watched the misses, which were instructive. Every competitor had them. A score of 99 was common. A perfect 100 was rare. It happened 3 times in the qualifying rounds, twice from the same competitor. A tall individual who moved with an economy that suggested either long experience or exceptional natural mechanical ability, probably both. Their name was in the program as Sek, and they were listed as a 3-cycle participant, which meant they had been in the trials long enough that the integration between their system and the event's sensor arrays would be extensive. A long integration meant the haptic feedback was tuned very fine. The misses, when they came, tended to cluster in a specific pattern, a throw that had been overcorrected. The Smart Assist had flagged a deviation and overcompensated, and the haptic feedback had pushed the arm through a correction that was marginally too aggressive, and the result was a throw that landed just past center in the opposite direction from the original deviation. You needed to know what to look for. The movement was small. The overcorrection was measured in a millimeter or less. But if you were watching the shoulder and the wrist separately and tracking where the throw landed relative to where the body had seemed to aim, you could see the system's fingerprint in the miss. The miss was not random. It was consistent with what the system was likely to do at a specific moment in the sensor feedback loop. I sat with that for a while, ate the not-quite coffee from a vendor on the gallery level, and kept watching. By the end of the qualifying session, I had notes on 14 pairs of competitors, sketches of correction patterns for the 7 I had been able to observe closely, and one observation that I thought was genuinely interesting. The competitors who scored the highest did not necessarily use the most aggressive correction settings on their Smart Assist. 2 of the top 5 performers had what looked like relatively conservative haptic feedback, visible in smaller late corrections, less adjustment, but more reliably placed. The competitors with the most dramatic microcorrections were scoring well but not at the top. There was a point at which more correction was not better than less, because the correction itself introduced a new variable. This made a kind of intuitive sense to me coming from darts. In throwing, there is a failure mode that experienced players call chasing, where you are so focused on hitting center that you keep adjusting, keep reading what you see and correcting for it, and the corrections compound on each other and the grouping gets worse rather than better. The solution to chasing is always the same. Stop correcting consciously, commit to the throw, trust what you have trained. The correction that comes from the body, preloaded, is more reliable than the correction that comes from the mind, in the moment. The Sethiru's smart assist systems were doing something structurally similar to the thing a dartist's mind does when it chases, reading, calculating, adjusting, and the best performers were apparently the ones whose systems had been refined or tuned to the point where the assist was minimal enough not to introduce overcorrection. The system had learned, in other words, to intervene less. Which was interesting, because the thing I had spent 25 years learning was to intervene not at all. I thought about that on the walk back to my quarters. That evening I threw for 2 hours. The board was at the wall, the distance taped. The arm was warm from the qualifying round session I had run in my mind all afternoon, which sounds strange, but is simply how it works when you have been throwing for long enough. Physical memory and mental memory are not entirely separate things. You can rehearse mechanics in your head with reasonable fidelity if you know them well enough, and then your body is more ready than it would otherwise be. I had read about this years ago in a sports science document my father had given me, back on the station where I had started throwing, and I had been skeptical at 11 and less skeptical by the time I was 30. My father had been the one who taught me to throw. He was not a competitive darts player. He was an environmental systems engineer who had come to the recreation facility in the evenings because there was nothing else to do, and had found the darts board and found it meditative, which is a word I would not have used at 11, but which I understood now. The meditative quality of darts is not spiritual in the way people sometimes mean when they use the word. It is the meditative quality of a task that requires full attention and produces a very clear and immediate result. You throw, you see where it lands, you understand immediately whether you did it correctly. There is no ambiguity. In most of life there is ambiguity, and the work of processing that ambiguity is constant and often invisible. In darts the feedback is instant and unambiguous. That quality is, I think, why people keep throwing. He was patient about it, which was not his natural register. My father was not an impatient person exactly, but he operated at a high speed, and the slowing down that teaching required was something he had to consciously engage with. He managed it with me because he understood something about the way skills are acquired that I only understood much later, that you cannot rush the early phase. The early phase is where the bad habits either form or don't, and a bad habit in a physical skill is much harder to remove than a gap in knowledge. You can fill a gap in knowledge by adding information. A bad habit requires you to first untrain the wrong movement, which means making yourself temporarily worse before you can get better, which most people find intolerable, and therefore most people keep the bad habit. He knew this, I think, from engineering. You do not patch a structural fault with surface material. You go back to the fault and address it at the source. And he applied the same principle to throwing darts with an 11-year-old in a recreation facility that smelled like recycled air and floor cleaner. So he taught me slowly. The grip first for an entire session, then the stance for another, then the draw, then the release, which took the longest because the release is where most of the error lives and where the bad habits most want to settle in. By the time we got to the follow-through, I already had the first 3 as automatic as breathing, and the follow-through fell into place quickly. He said, "Now throw at the board without thinking about any of it." I threw, and the dart hit where I meant it to hit, and he said, "That is what you are building, not the dart hitting the board today. The capacity to throw without thinking about it, after enough repetitions that the whole sequence has become reflexive. That is what the practice is for." I thought about that explanation many times over the following 25 years. The capacity to do something without thinking about it, not because you have stopped paying attention, but because the attention has been relocated, moved from the conscious machinery into the body's automatic systems, so the conscious mind is free to observe the environment and the body just does the work. That relocation is what training is. Most people call it muscle memory and leave it at that, but it is more specific than that phrasing suggests. What you are actually doing is building a model in your nervous system, a precise, high-fidelity model of what correct feels like, and then teaching that model to run without supervision. The supervision is what you provide in the early phase, and then you gradually withdraw it. And if you have built the model correctly, the model runs on its own. My father threw for 30 years. I have thrown for 25. His groupings at the end were better than mine are now, which he found appropriate and I found motivating. He died on a station he had been sent to fix 3 years before the Cultural Engagement Directorate invitation landed in my queue. I would have liked to tell him about Coveth Ring. He would have found it funny, and then he would have asked about the scoring system in detail, because he found scoring systems interesting, and then he would have wanted to see the field notes. He would particularly have wanted to see the part where the official checked the array diagnostics twice, looking for a signal that wasn't there, because the score was higher than the equipment was supposed to be capable of, and the only explanation was one that the equipment couldn't produce. I threw until my groupings were tight and my arm was tired in the right way. Then I went to sleep. The second day was the main competitive rounds. I was in my gallery seat before the session began. The Sethiru who had spoken to me the day before was 2 seats away again and gave a brief acknowledging tilt of the head, which I returned. The floor filled with the morning's competitors. The session began. The scores were higher than qualifying. That was expected. Qualifying had been about clearing the threshold, and the main rounds were about the ceiling. The top competitors threw with a consistency that was, objectively, extraordinary. There is a particular pleasure in watching something done at the edge of what is possible, even especially when the thing being done is not the thing you do. I have watched competitive shooters. I have watched surgeons work. I have watched a structural engineer fit a load-bearing component into a space with 3 millimeters of tolerance on each side, by feel, in the dark, because the lighting had failed. The quality of attention in all of those cases is similar. It is the quality of a person who has compressed a very large amount of practice into a particular set of movements, and is now executing those movements without waste. The Sethiru main card competitors had that quality. I watched it with genuine respect and took my notes. Eruvan Sek was in the 4th pair and posted a round of 97.6, which produced a murmur in the gallery that I gathered was appreciation rather than disappointment. Their pair partner, shorter, more compact, with an unusual 3-point grip on the upper throwing limb, posted 94.1. Both advanced. Eruvan Sek's throws were, as I had noted in qualifying, distinguished by an unusual economy. Most competitors showed the late wrist correction on nearly every throw. Eruvan Sek showed it on fewer throws, as though their integration was refined enough that the pre-correction work had been moved earlier in the sequence, into the setup rather than the release, and the last-moment adjustment was largely redundant. I was watching one of their passes through the leftmost lane of the floor when the Sethiru beside me spoke again. The Veth pair is consistent this cycle, they said, which was an assessment rather than a question. Very consistent. The tall one, I said. Yes, Eruvan Sek, 3 consecutive cycles in the top bracket, they considered. They may post a 98 today. They've been overcorrecting on the left lane throws, I said. 3rd throw in each round. The smart assist is flagging a drift that isn't there, or not as much as it's compensating for. The lane sensor array may have a calibration offset on that side. It's consistent across the session. A pause, the filaments move through a slow sweep. You notice that? It's consistent, I said. Might even out, or it might cost them a point on that lane when the stakes are higher and they're throwing at a tighter average. You have been watching the corrections, they said. That's what I've been here to watch, I said. They turned back to the floor and said nothing further, but I noticed that on Sek's next pass through the left lane, the Sethiru next to me leaned slightly forward. Sek's third throw in that lane dropped to 95.3. Not a miss, not a disaster, but notably below their average and consistent with what I had marked in my notes. The Sethiru beside me settled back. A moment passed. You have a good eye, they said eventually. I've been throwing for about 25 years, I said. You learn to see it. They looked at me again with that direct, forward-facing regard. What is the human apparatus, they said, if not Smart Assist guided? I looked up the entry documentation after we spoke yesterday. Your equipment is listed as, they seem to be retrieving the exact language, manually deployed fixed-flight projectile, regulation bristle surface static target. No sensor interface. No haptic component. That's accurate, I said. That is, they paused again, and again the pause was not unkind, just precise. That is entirely unassisted. Yes. They looked at the floor where the current pair was mid-round and then back at me. How do you account for deviation? They said. Wind in here is minimal but not zero. There are micro-tremors from the station structure. The environmental systems run a constant cycle. Individual variation in muscle activation between throws. The temperature of the projectile. The grip pressure. They were, I understood, listing the variables that the Smart Assist system existed to compensate for. All of these require correction. How do you correct for them without an assist system? Practice, I said. They waited to see if I was going to add to that. I wasn't. Practice, they repeated. Enough of it, I said. You stop compensating consciously. Your body does it. It learns what correct feels like and repeats it. You're not doing the math in real time. You've done the math enough times that it's built in. It's in the motion itself. The correction is pre-calculated in the sense that your body has experienced the relevant deviations and learned the relevant adjustments and encoded them. Not in a processor, in the arm. The Sethiru was quiet for a long time. The current pair finished their round. There was measured gallery applause. The next pair took their positions. That is a different approach, they said finally. It works at shorter ranges, I said. I'm not going to pretend it's equivalent to what I've been watching today. It's a different thing. The trial's distance is longer than my standard by nearly 2 meters. There will be more drift. My corrections will be less precise than the corrections your competitors are making. I'm aware of all of that. But you will throw, they said. Yes, I said. At 4.2 meters. Yes. They considered this for a moment. Then they went back to watching the floor, and so did I, and we did not speak again until the intermission. The intermission was called after the morning's main card session. The secondary floor, a smaller lane configuration set up adjacent to the main floor, was readied for the exhibition slots. There were 4 exhibition entrants in total. Myself, 2 Velith observers who had apparently entered as a diplomatic courtesy, and a 4th being from a species I did not recognize who arrived at the check-in point with equipment that looked more sophisticated than mine, but still lacked the full Smart Assist array. The Velith were squat and 4-armed, and had the quality of beings who entered contests. They had no expectation of winning, and found this perfectly satisfactory, which I respected. We were not announced. The secondary floor had no gallery. It had a small standing area along one wall where a handful of people had gathered during the intermission. Most of them I suspected there, because they had finished their meals early and found themselves with a few minutes to fill. There were perhaps 30 observers, mostly Sethiru, standing at the rail with the low-key attention of people who expect to see something mildly interesting and will not be surprised if they don't. A handful of them had drinks. One was consulting a tablet. The sensor arrays in the secondary lanes were the same specification as the main floor. This was not a courtesy or an upgrade. It was simply how the Rethek facility ran its infrastructure. They did not maintain two grades of equipment. Whatever I threw would be measured the same way a qualifying Sethiru throw would be measured, scored to the same 4 decimal places, logged in the same system, in the separate column but logged. I was assigned lane 3. I set up the board at the far end of the lane, unrolled the bristle surface, fitted the frame. The board went up clean. I measured the throw line distance with my tape and set the marker. The official assigned to the lane, a younger Sethiru, from the look of them, doing the kind of duty that gets assigned to the junior staff, watched me do this with the expression of someone who is not quite sure what they are watching, but is professionally obliged to pay attention. The competition distance for exhibition is set to standard trial specification, they said. What is that? I asked. 4.2 meters, they said. I looked at the lane, the board was up, the tape said what it said. That's fine, I said. The official looked at my board, at the throw line at me. Their filaments moved. You will be throwing to a distance of 4.2 meters, they said, with the careful tone of someone confirming that the other party has understood a relevant piece of information. Yes, I said, that's fine. They made a note on their tablet and stepped back. 4 meters. I had thrown at 4 meters before. Not routinely, competition distance for standard human darts is 2.37, and I trained mostly at regulation distance, but in informal settings and in the kind of sessions where you spend an evening moving the line back in half-meter increments to find out where things fall apart. 4 meters is harder. The flight path is longer, which means more time in the air and more opportunity for drift, which means the release has to be cleaner and the follow-through more committed, and the pre-correction work more deeply encoded. It requires you to throw slightly harder to maintain appropriate velocity at impact, but not so hard that you lose the fine control. The sweet spot is narrow. At 4 meters, your margin for error is smaller than at regulation, and you cannot be casual about it. I had found in those informal sessions over the years that I could hold a consistent grouping at 4 meters. Not my tightest grouping, that was at regulation distance, as you would expect, but a consistent one. Consistent enough that I had a reasonable picture of what 4.2 meters would produce. I was not going to be as accurate as at regulation. I was going to be less accurate than the Sethiru main card competitors. I had been telling myself, and the Sethiru in the gallery, that this was fine, and I meant it. What I did not know, what I was here to find out, was what 4.2 meters with 25 years behind it looked like on a scoring system that measured to 4 decimal places. The Velith went first in the exhibition bracket as a pair, and their throws were enthusiastic and landed in the outer third of the scoring gradient. The scores were logged. There was polite acknowledgement from the standing observers, the kind of applause that is genuine but not surprised, because the outcome was the expected one. The 4th entrant went next, alone with their partially assisted setup, and posted a respectable middle-range score. Better than the Velith, lower than the trial's threshold, safely within the range of what had been anticipated for exhibition. The observers watched with moderate interest. One of the tablet consultants made a note. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the throw line with the case open on the floor behind me, 12 darts laid out in their foam, and the board at the far end of the lane. The official calibrated the sensor array for human projectile profile. This took a moment and required a brief data exchange, because the array had not been calibrated for tungsten darts at standard human flight weight, and the profile had to be entered manually. The official conferred with someone via their communication device, then confirmed ready. I picked up the first dart. The observers at the rail were paying attention in the way that people pay attention to something that might be briefly interesting before it becomes briefly disappointing. I was aware of this. It did not change anything about what was about to happen, because What was about to happen was the same thing that had been happening for 25 years. I was going to stand at a throw line and put tungsten close to center, the same way I always did, in whatever environment I found myself in. The environment was different from any I had thrown in before. The distance was longer. The scoring system was more precise. The observers were a different species. None of that changed the mechanics. I have a pre-throw routine that I have had for so long I no longer think of it as a routine. It is simply what I do. A breath, let out slowly, the ribcage settling. Grip check, the barrel sits in the same place on the same two fingers, the thumb behind every time without exception. Elbow up to the correct angle, which my body knows the way it knows the weight of my own arm. Sight line established, eye, dart, target in one plane. A brief stillness. The stillness is the whole game. Everything before it is preparation. The stillness is the moment before the throw where the noise stops and the body knows what it is about to do. In 25 years of throwing, I have found that the stillness is almost always there when I need it, and the throws that miss are usually the ones where I shortened the stillness, hurried it, told myself I was ready before I was. When the stillness is full and real, the throw follows from it without extra work. You don't throw, the throw happens. I threw the first dart. It traveled 4.2 meters through still station air, through the air that smelled faintly of Sethiru environmental systems and whatever they used to clean the lane floors, and hit the target. The sensor array captured it. The score appeared on the lane display, 89.4. There was a brief silence at the rail. Not a long silence, a beat. The kind of pause that happens when something unexpected registers, and the audience has not yet formed a response to it. 89.4 was not a qualifying score for the trial's main event. The qualifying threshold was significantly higher, but it was also not the score that had been expected from an exhibition entrant with a flat board and a tin case of tungsten darts. The scoring gradient on the Sethiru target was continuous, not sectioned, and landing 89.4 on a continuous gradient at 4.2 meters, unassisted, was not in the range of what had been anticipated. I could tell this because the official at the lane looked at the score, looked at the target surface, and looked back at the score in that order twice. I picked up the second dart. The second dart, 91.1, a better throw than the first. The release had been cleaner, the stillness longer. Third, 90.7. Fourth, 91.3. Fifth, 90.9. By the fifth dart, the standing observers had stopped the low background conversation that had been running between them and were watching the lane with the quality of attention that means something has exceeded expectations. I was not watching them. I was watching the board, picking up darts, resetting my stance, running the routine. The routine is the same every time. That is the entire point of having it. Sixth, 92.1. The dart sat just off-center in a way that I recognized as a very clean throw. The kind that your arm knows before you see the score. Seventh, 90.8. A slight drift right, which told me the station's micro-tremors were running in a consistent direction. I made a note of that, not a conscious note, the other kind, the kind that goes into the arm. Eighth, 91.6. I had adjusted for the drift. By the 10th dart, a small group of people who had been standing further along the secondary floor had drifted toward lane 3. I was aware of this peripherally. I did not look up from the board. 9th, 91.2. 10th, 92.4. By the 10th dart, my running average was 91.1. The official was no longer making notes on their tablet. They were watching the board. 11th, 91.8. 12th, 93.6, the arm fully warm now, the routine fully settled, the micro-tremor correction fully encoded. The last throw of a good round is usually the best. 25 years of rounds, and that has almost always been true. The round closed, the sensor array tabulated. The final score appeared on the lane display, 91.8. Averaged across 12 throws. at 4.2 meters, with 12 tungsten darts and a bristle board. No guidance array, no haptic calibration rig, no smart assist housing, no sensor interface of any kind. No active component in the equipment. Just the darts, the board, and the throws, and whatever it is that 25 years of repetition builds into a body. The official looked at the result. Then they looked at the array diagnostics. Then they looked at the result again. Then they called someone on their communication device and spoke briefly and listened and spoke again and went back to the array diagnostics. The standing observers at the rail were not standing in the way that suggests they are there, because they finished their meals early. The Sethiru from the gallery, the one who had explained on the first day that the exhibition bracket was a good opportunity to observe the event format, was there. I had not noticed them arrive. They were at the back of the group, and they were not saying anything. Their filaments were very still in a way that I had learned, over 2 days of observation, was the Sethiru version of processing something that has not yet resolved into a response. The official finished their review of the array diagnostics. They had checked, as far as I could tell, whether any active component had been recorded in the lane during my round, whether the equipment had interfaced with the sensor array in any assisted way, whether there was any signal in the log that corresponded to guidance or haptic feedback or smart assist output. The diagnostics would have caught any such signal. They logged everything the array detected. There was nothing to log that hadn't already been logged. The darts were tungsten. The board was bristle. The throws were unassisted by any definition the Rithek trials had ever applied to that word. The score was what it was. The official made a note on their tablet. I took the darts from the retrieval tray, checked the points, all intact. One flight slightly askew from the impact on throw 9, which I straightened, and put them back in the case in their foam cutouts. The Sethiru from the gallery came to the throw line. 91.8, they said. Yes, I said. They looked at the closed case, unassisted. Yes. A long pause. Their filaments moved through the slow, considered sweep. The array diagnostics confirmed no active interface, they said. I know. That score, they stopped, reconsidered their phrasing. That score would have qualified for the secondary bracket of the main event. I noticed, I said. Not the top bracket, they said, carefully. No, I said, not the top bracket. The top bracket is extraordinary. What I watched today is extraordinary. I meant it without qualification. The Sethiru main card competitors were extraordinary, in the way that any person doing a very difficult thing very well is extraordinary, and I had watched them for 2 days with genuine appreciation. My score was not a refutation of their scores. It was a different number produced by a different means, and the different means was what was at issue. But 91.8, they said. 91.8, I agreed. They were quiet again. Then, the approach you described, practice, your body learning what correct feels like. Yes. The math built in. Something like that. How many throws, they said. It was not quite a question, it was the end of a calculation they were doing. I thought about it. You can do the arithmetic. The session since I was 11, the average session length, the approximate number of throws in a session, the years. I had done it once years ago, and the number was large enough to be briefly alarming and then settle into something that simply explained certain things about my arm. I did not carry the number around. It was not a number that needed to be carried around, because the number was not the point. The number was just the mechanism by which the point had been achieved. Enough, I said. They looked at the case one more time, then at me. Their forward-facing regard had the quality that it had had at the start, direct, assessing, but the assessment was different now, and I could tell this not from any Sethiru physiognomy I was fluent in but simply from the length and texture of the pause. Something had been revised. Some prior calculation that had placed the human entrant in the exhibition bracket's separate column had been reopened, the relevant variables reconsidered. the conclusion modified. It was not, I want to be clear, anything that looked like embarrassment. The Sethiru are too composed for that, at least in public and in the context of a formal event. But it was in the same category as embarrassment, the adjacent category, the one where you realized that a variable you had set to 0, or set to negligible, not worth including, had value, had been there the whole time, and your model was wrong not because it was carelessly wrong, but because the variable had never presented itself for inclusion before. That is a different kind of wrong. It is the kind where there is nothing to apologize for exactly, but there is something to recalibrate. "Welcome to the Rethek trials," they said finally, which was what the registration official had said to me 2 days ago, and which now had a somewhat different quality to it. "Thank you," I said. I attended the post-event reception, which was held in the main hall adjacent to the competition floor. The Sethiru catered these things well, food in varying formats for the species present, lighting that was reasonably comfortable, enough space that you could stand apart from the main groups without being conspicuous about it. I had a plate of the grain and broth dish that had been good in the canteen, which was equally good here, and stood near one of the columns at the edge of the room and observed. Eruvan Sek, the tall competitor who had posted the highest main event scores, was across the room in a cluster that appeared to be conducting a post-match analysis. There was a tablet with their throw data on it. Occasionally, one of the group looked over at me and said something and then looked back at the tablet. This happened several times. I found it only mildly interesting. The data they were looking at was available in the official record. If the question they were asking was how a manually deployed fixed-flight projectile with no sensor interface had averaged 91.8 at 4.2 meters, the answer was in the official record too, under the column headed Equipment, where it said, "Manually deployed fixed-flight projectile, regulation bristle surface static target, no active components." The answer was that there was no trick. There was no hidden component. The component was in the thrower. At a certain point in the reception, an official I had not previously spoken to approached and introduced themselves as Sethiru, the trials coordinator, which was a senior administrative position that I gathered involved oversight of the whole event structure. They were older than anyone else I had spoken to, with a quality of deliberate stillness that suggested very long experience with situations that required careful handling. "Warrant Officer Vang," they said. "Yes," I said. "I reviewed the exhibition round results," they said. "All right," I said. "I want to note," they said with care, "that the exhibition bracket results are recorded in a separate column." "I know," I said. "They are not," they seem to be choosing their words with the precision of someone accustomed to precision. "They are not competitive in the formal sense. The official rankings for this cycle will reflect the main card results." "I understand," I said. "However," they said, they let the however settle for a moment. "However, the array diagnostics are logged. The full round record is logged. These are part of the official record of the trials in perpetuity." "I assumed they would be," I said. Sethiru looked at me for a moment. 91.8, they said. "Yes," I said. "At 4.2 meters." "Yes." "Unassisted." I had now said yes to this combination of words enough times that it felt like a refrain. "Yes," I said. They were quiet briefly. "Then we did not know," they said, and the "we" was careful, inclusive, meaning the Sethiru broadly rather than just this committee, that an unassisted human throw at this distance could produce scores in this range. Consistently, across 12 throws. A pause. "The variance in your round was smaller than we would have expected." "Consistency is what the practice is for," I said. "Yes," they said, "that is becoming clear." Another pause, slightly longer. "The invitation next cycle, it will not be routed through the exhibition bracket." I did not say anything to that immediately. I ate a piece of the grain. "Assuming," Sethiru said, "you would like to return." "I'll check my schedule," I said. They gave a brief inclination of the head. The Sethiru equivalent, I had gathered over 2 days, of a dry acknowledgement that one has just received a diplomatically mild response to a question that had more weight than it appeared to. Then they moved off toward another group, and I finished my plate, and eventually made my way back to my quarters. I updated my field log with the day's observations. Reception, good. Food, good. Throw 91.8 at 4.2 m, 12 darts, no active components, official record. Variance within expected. Then I packed the case in the board. The board went flat, the flights folded into their case, the tungsten barrels in their foam cutouts in the order I had put them in 25 years ago when I had the case cut and never changed it. I checked the points. All intact. 2 latches closed. On the way out of the station the following morning, I passed the registration desk. Irkit was on duty again. "Warrant officer," they said. "Good morning," I said. They looked at the case, then at me. Their filaments moved through the slow sweep. "Safe travels," they said. The customs official at the transit hub, 3 junctions down, scanned my documentation and then looked at the equipment declaration, which listed the case and board with the same notation. No active components, no sensor interface, no smart assist housing. She looked at the case, looked at the screen, looked at me. "You brought darts," she said. "Yes," I said. A short pause. "To the Rithek trials." "Yes," I said. She stamped the documentation and handed it back. She had the look of someone who had decided something was not her department, but who was going to be turning it over for the rest of the shift. I boarded the transit and stowed the case in the overhead compartment and settled into a seat that was, as expected, slightly too tall. My feet did not quite reach the floor. I found a comfortable position and watched the Kovith Ring station recede in the port window, its docking arms extended, the whole structure precise and clean in the way that Sethiru work tends to be precise and clean. My superior sent a message before I cleared the transit hub's communication range. It said, "Results came through. The bracket record. How?" I wrote back, 25 years. There was the pause that transit latency produces, and then her reply came, "That's going in your file." I wrote it should. She did not reply to that, which meant either the message hadn't cleared or she agreed. The transit sealed its locks and moved out from the station and into the transit corridor. I closed my eyes for a while, because the transit was long and there was nothing urgent to look at, and then I thought about the 12th throw. The last one in the round, 93.6. The one where the arm had been fully warm and the routine had been fully in place, and the stillness before the throw had been the clean, full kind, no noise in it. The dart had left my hand and traveled 4.2 meters through Sethiru station air and landed where I meant it to land, and the sensor array had measured it to 4 decimal places and logged it in the official record of the Rithek trials, in the separate column. It had been a good throw. I had thrown better in other rooms in other years, but at 4.2 meters, with 30 observers at the rail and a scoring system that did not round, and 25 years in the arm, it had been a good throw. I was satisfied with that. My arm was going to be sore tomorrow. The distance had asked more of it than regulation, and 2 days of watching followed by a 12-dart round at 4.2 meters was a full session by any measure. I would work through it in the morning, on the transit, with the stretching routine I had learned from a physiotherapist at my second posting who had told me that the tendons appreciate being reminded they exist. They do. Good advice, remembered. Outside the port window, the Kovith Ring receded until it was a point of light among other points of light, and then it was gone.